what I'm going to be talking about today, it'll take about half an hour, but if I start waffling, it might take longer. I hope not. Is sustainable use, but also CBNRM, community-based natural resource management, and wildlife corridors using KAZA, which is in Southern Africa. I'll introduce it in a moment as an example. Can I just get to know about my audience a bit more? How many of you are students, undergraduates or postgrads? How many? Can you put your hands up if you're students? Okay, that's great. There's a majority. And how many people are from or have good experience in Southern Africa? I know a few people, so they certainly have experience. Okay, quite a few of you. That means I have to behave myself and not exaggerate too much. So good, it's good to know that some of you are from the region, and I hope you find something of value in this. The reflections I'm going to make come from a piece of work I've just done. Well, let me show you the first slide, first of all, because that might make more sense. So how about that? There we go. Better. So you've heard already that I did my DPhil in crocodile ecology. I started it in one country and ended it in another, because it was Rhodesia when I went there, and it was Zimbabwe happily when I finished. But that's where I did my research. So I started, like many of you in this room today, as a researcher. My main interest in wildlife conservation was about the animals itself or the plants and doing research. And if you look at my list of roles that I've played formally, the first 2 or 3 were really about research, and I really wanted to be a researcher. But as you go down the list, you'll see there's more management responsibility, and then kind of people expect more about leadership. And that's the reason I'm raising that, is that's some of you in the room will recognize this already because you've been through it. And right at the bottom, it should say retired. In fact, let me just check if I put it in. No, I didn't. Your career suddenly falls off a cliff, but that's another story. But you go through this when you are a researcher, and then for various reasons, you end up doing management, partly because there's a job role coming up and you apply to do it. You don't really want to do it because it's not all research, but maybe you've got a family coming, or your buddy is going to get the job and you don't want to work for your buddy. And for various reasons, you climb up that ladder. And the reason I'm raising that is it's a great example where several times in my career, I've been completely stuck. I haven't known what I'm doing. I got to be director of UNEP WCMC, and I couldn't even read the balance sheets for the end of the month. And that's called the Peter Principle, where you rise to your own level of incompetence. And I just wanted to say as an introduction that all of you are starting, and many of you who have been through this will recognize where you get into a job and you're really not qualified for it, right? You don't have the knowledge. You should have probably done an MBA, which I wish I'd done, but I didn't. But that's why you come to a place like DICE, right? And you do your work and you do your master's course. And another example is the University of Cambridge, Masters in Conservation Leadership. This is how you retool and you avoid failing as you move along that slippery ladder. Anyway, that's a little bit of a diversion, but I just wanted to make it relevant to the students with us here today. Hopefully there is something here of value. So I did my research, as you heard, in Zimbabwe on crocodiles, and that's where I was introduced to the complexity and the confusion sometimes, and all the paradoxes in nature conservation, not just in Africa, but everywhere. So I started working with these animals, putting radio tracking collars on and everything, but gradually over the next 5 years, I helped evolve a program where the crocodile eggs were collected in the wild, mostly along Lake Kariba in the Zambezi Valley. Not just a few. It started with 6,000, ended with 40,000 eggs a year. Those eggs were brought in to a farming environment like this one on Lake Kariba. These little animals were raised for their skins. A number of them were returned to the wild as a percentage, so that crocodiles were not endangered. but most of them, if they were lucky, ended up as leather and ended up as handbags. Now, this is a paradox, right? How is making crocodiles into handbags good conservation? Well, it turned out that it was good conservation. In fact, it was one of the only ways that you could get people to put up with crocodiles. So we ended up with this positive self-reinforcing loop. So everybody in the whole chain benefited from it. So the local people who were living on Kariba hated crocodiles. The crocodiles would eat their animals and their children sometimes. But worst of all, not worst of all, but I mean, more importantly, on a day-to-day basis, they would get tangled in their filament nets when they were fishing, and they would destroy the nets. And then the crocodile eventually would drown. So everybody hated crocodiles. But each of the eggs we collected in the wild, we gave $3 back to the community from whence they came. And if you're collecting 40,000 eggs, that's quite a lot of money going into rural communities who didn't have a cash economy at all. And then furthermore, the leather tanning, there was an industry around that. The crocodile farming industry was a huge employer. And then finally, government got taxes from the whole process. So it was a massive business that grew out of nature conservation, because this was a Parks and Wildlife Department project. It was a conservation project. It wasn't a project to make money. It was a project to try and generate revenue for communities. And it cartwheeled away. So that's an example of sustainable use, which I'm sure you're aware of, or an element of sustainable use. But right in the middle of my research, it was a very exciting time. The World Conservation Strategy came out from IUCN, WWF, and UNEP, which talked about sustainable development and how important conservation was, but also how important the sustainable development process was to conservation. And IUCN, can I just have, is there anybody familiar with, or really familiar with IUCN? I guess many of you will be members of specialist groups. Can I just check? There's quite a few hands. IUCN is a great organization. It kind of made my career through, I was doing crocodile research, and how do you meet other crocodile researchers around the world? You did it through the IUCN networks. And they took on sustainable use, partly because it was in their mission. And the mission was that the use of natural resources needs to be equitable and ecologically sustainable. So that's what they said about use. It has to be sustainable. Now, some people didn't like that at all, which was perfectly reasonable. So there's a great quote here from David Favre, who you used to know quite well, that the use of wildlife might be biologically sustainable, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's ethically acceptable. Elephants are not turnips. To kill elephants for the sole purpose of selling their body parts, like ivory, is unacceptable. That's a perfectly valid point of view, and many of you may hold it. I probably did myself when I was at university. But others, myself included, thought that this was actually way too passive. We thought that it shouldn't just be sustainable within ecological limits, but it should address human well-being. And it should address human well-being by generating conspicuous benefits such as income. In other words, the crocodile approach, strategy, should be used more widely. And this formulation, from this formulation derives incentive-driven conservation. Let's give everybody, local people, governments, business, the incentive, right, to value wildlife and want more of it. This, for us, was also ethical. So you can see there are two bodies of thought there, all of whom are conservationists, all of whom care about nature and wildlife, but very different philosophical views. And this is really, really important in nature conservation. We're not all the same, we don't all think the same way, and we don't all have the same experiences. But these are all valid voices, and like anything else in society, we have to listen to others. The important reason I was raising this really was that DICE was an early player in this. So the research, these are two papers from 2003. One came from Thomasina Oldfield, who some of you may know. She's still working in this field. She recently left traffic and is consulting. But also Nigel Leader-Williams, of course, who used to be the director here. And then the other was the same year, Nigel Leader-Williams and myself. And the second one ended up being a manifesto. It was a manifesto because I was standing to be the IUCN chair of the Sustainable Youth Specialist Group. And this paper laid out what we thought, what our philosophy was. I actually went through it again the other day, and I'd love to tell you to go and take it and read it, because it's great. It is so turgid and boring, I cannot tell you. Just what were we thinking? And we took something which is really exciting, right, and really interesting, and we turned it into a bunch of text which I wouldn't want to repeat. But that's a little aside. So that's why I got involved with DICE. Nigel Leader-Williams and colleagues were kind enough to make me Professor of Sustainable Resource Management here. And I spent a lot of time with students examining and doing all sorts of things in that period. I haven't been back here for some time, partly because we've been living for quite a while in Switzerland. And the last time I was back, I think, was probably 2012, when I think in this room I gave a talk about conservation in the global garden, which I'm going to feed a little bit on that and tell you what I said back in 2012 to an audience a bit like this. Now, at that time, there had been the Aichi targets. It was very clear by that stage, at this time I was now running UNEP WCMC, and we were doing a lot of this work, that the state of biodiversity was still in major decline. The pressures were growing. The responses were also growing, which is a good thing, right? But we certainly were not winning the war. The Aichi targets of 2010 were not met. We spent some time discussing pressures and threats, the habitat loss, the invasive species, overexploitation, and pollution, which I think includes greenhouse gases. And I argued then that the response to this crisis was 20th century, right? It was we're still doing in 2012, when I gave this talk, exactly what we've been doing in 1998, 1999, and probably as far back as 1946 and earlier. Nothing really very much had changed. And so the main tools that we were trying to mobilize to stop the declining biodiversity, first of all, was education, and you can't argue with that, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Really important. Legislation, law, protected animals, protected species, all sorts of legislation, very important. You need law. But also protection, and that usually meant exclusion and enforcement. And this is where some of us began to have real problems. In fact, everybody, I think, recognized that exclusion and extreme enforcement really wasn't a long-term solution. But it went on, and it still goes on. But despite all of those approaches, we knew that they were not successful, right? The indicators continued to go down, and they may have bottomed out. But don't forget, it's on the red list is bottoming out. Everyone's getting excited. But don't forget, when you've got nothing left, there's nothing more you can lose. So it's not necessarily good news when these curves start to turn up, because you've used most of your biodiversity. So the outcome of this business unusual was really unfortunate in the part of Africa I was there working. So there was increased human-wildlife conflict around the protected areas, but also in the corridors between protected areas, which were open and manifold at that time. really unnoticed, traditional forms of control and incentive had disappeared. The chiefly ownership or influence over wildlife resources in Zambia, Zimbabwe, all the countries of that region that I'm reasonably familiar with, that have pretty much disappeared. Not so much in Zambia, but certainly almost totally so in Zimbabwe, for example, South Africa. And then offtake was criminalized. But it was criminalized, so the law owned all wildlife, but the law had no resources or people, not enough people, to enforce that. So they turned wildlife and nature into an open access resource. Even today, if you go to Central and West Africa, the law in most places is that all the trees belong to the government. So everybody who goes out with an axe every day to cut a tree to build a hut is breaking the law. Of course, no one enforces it, but it just makes the law ridiculous. The value of wildlife declined. We don't want to use rhino horn, we don't want to use ivory, we don't want to kill animals. And then agriculture started to spread into the marginal lands, by which I mean the drier lands where cattle hadn't been before. People started to push their wildlife in there because they were not able to make any money out of the animals, the wild animals. Budgets for protected areas kept falling, and they still are. Protected areas were under huge pressure, and people helped themselves to the resources because people still needed, the protected areas were there. And this is not uniform in every country and every place at every period of time, but it's the general axiom that people were not allowed into the park to collect firewood, to harvest grasses, to thatch their huts, to cut poles, to put their cattle in during drought. Now this has changed over time. There's much more interaction between people and the park managers, but certainly in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, that really wasn't the case. And so the resources they took also included the land themselves. There are people who had historic or felt they had historic rights to land, and they occupied it. And recently during the land issues in Zimbabwe, for example, it wasn't only the commercial farms that were taken. There was quite a bit of wildlife, land, state land, which changed hands. Some of it was formalized, some of it wasn't. And Africa is littered with parks, and I'll show you a few in a minute. We call them paper parks. They're on paper. Actually, paper parks are a bit old-fashioned now. They're in the World Database for Protected Areas on Protected Planet. Great database, but there's probably not very much protection. And the worst thing of all is that there's been a revolution, particularly in Southern Africa. And people are not just people, right? They're not just poor people who you can tell what to do. They are voters, right? They have the vote. These are the voters you're making unhappy. The voters have very little sympathy for wildlife. It's not the same everywhere. There are some places where they do, where benefits and things flow. But by and large, you know, they're not anti. They'd like to see an impala. They know about this. There are totems that they have, but they don't want it in their garden, as I wouldn't either. So we search for alternative ideas. And for me, this focus, because I was now in Southern Africa, on strategies in Southern Africa. And so this is also what I shared with DICE colleagues in 2012. Exclusion was considered to be a colonial legacy in most of Southern Africa, right? There were still racial tensions, there were racial wars going on, in fact, when I arrived out there. And all these fences, like this one here, featuring my good lady wife, were erected theoretically, or the argument was, to keep elephants out of people's crops. But I know, because I was in national parks for many years, that there was another side to this, which was that the fences were also there as a pretext not to allow people's livestock into the park either. Right? Now, there were good technical reasons for this, not least disease control, but without taking the local communities with them, it just was viewed as kind of, well, it was viewed as this, ecological apartheid. And so animals in parks have absolute right of way, right? But the second they walk out of a park and they eat someone's granary, or if I change taxa from elephants a bit, if they eat their goats, these are lions in Zimbabwe, which we came across, which had been poisoned after eating some goats up near Lake Kariba. The outcome is that, that the animal gives way. So inside they have absolute right of way. Outside there's often zero tolerance. So you've just got this, black and white, red green kind of binomial thing going on. And if you go to Kruger, if you're familiar with Kruger, there's 1 million people on the edge of Kruger, Bushbuck Ridge, right, who live this existence every day. And I don't know how long they can keep that up. But the other thing about Southern Africa was that they were beginning to recognize the costs of exclusion and enforcement, which most people had never done. So these people who are collecting water in the dry season in the, which river they're in? I'm tempted to say the Kafue, I can't remember. It might be the Luanga. They have to do that. There is no other clean water, right? And there's nowhere else to get water for their families. This is inside a national park. This chap making a canoe up in Niassa Reserve in Mozambique. The big trees are all in the park now, but they're excluded. This individual was arrested and his canoe was burnt, which was a waste of a tree. Of course, we have a lot of sympathy for this when we talk about the Baka people in Central Africa, because we know that they live in the forest, and we think, well, that's their place and they should be able to live there. And excluding them from resources sends the world bananas, quite rightly. I was in WWF when there was a scandal in DRC, and the Baka people were bullied and abused by rangers, and it raised an international scandal. But when you come closer to home, I'm thinking Zimbabwe now, this is an anti-poaching team. There are people in the back of that Land Rover and a lot of wire snares there. What happened was that those people were captured, they were thrown in the back of the vehicle. They weren't, in this case, abused in any way, but that was often the case if there was no one there supervising. They went off to the magistrate down at Gokwe. They were found guilty and they were given 3 months in prison for poaching. Now, those people had said goodbye to their families in the morning and said, I'm going out to get some food. And he disappeared for 3 months. Nobody knew. There was no system for telling the family where they'd gone. They just walked out in the morning and they were never seen again for 3 months, and they arrived back. I mean, this is not a human way of dealing with anything, right? Never mind nature conservation, which by definition for me is meant to be a good thing. So these were the kind of things that the Southern Africans were beginning to recognize were a problem, and they were not sustainable, and they certainly weren't ethical. So they developed the idea of building a wildlife economy where there were incentives based on benefits. And they derived benefits from phototourism. Of course they do. Fantastic. I hope you all get a chance to do this. In Botswana, people pay. In fact, I'm staggered at how much people pay. A very good friend of mine is the Chief Finance Officer at Wilderness, and I can't say too much, but I mean, it's taking a family there for Christmas is virtually, the annual salary for, that I was earning. I mean, and that's a good thing, right? Because the money flows back into the local community and creates a really obvious economic incentive. But there's also value, whatever you think about it, from trophy hunting, which is tourism of a different type, much more controversial, of course, and value from parts and derivatives. A lot of people would have no problem with impala meat for feeding local villagers, but they do get more upset about some other types of parts and derivatives, which have caused a lot of fuss in the conservation community and still do. And I think you all know what that is. The rationale behind the wildlife economy, though, is quite good. The rationale is that instead of having cattle and goats and whatever in the savannas of eastern southern Africa, actually wildlife, if you manage it properly, can outcompete it on an economic basis. And that's because cattle, you get meat and you get skins, of course you do, but you also get meat and skins from wild animals. But on top of that, you get trophy hunting and you get tourism as well. And once you start looking at those systems, and that's why virtually the whole of northern South Africa, what used to be called the Transvaal, now is full of all these game ranches, private game ranches, right? Because the farmers make more money from wildlife than they can from cattle. And the same logic holds everywhere. The issues then, though, become ownership and governance. And that's now where we're getting to the rub, right? What's really important for nature conservation. Anyways, the key message from Southern Africa was that we shouldn't just focus on taking away value by stopping trade and things, but actually we want to increase the value so that people want more of it. Maybe it was a bit simplistic, but no, it was interesting to look at. So this was happening on privately held rangelands and still is, but it was also extended to community-held farms. And this was through things like the Campfire Program in Zimbabwe, these community-based natural resource management projects. And they began to flourish in the 1980s and 1990s. This approach was not without its problems and challenges, both internal and external. I mean, communities are humans, and when there's money flowing, I mean, you know, there were all sorts of competition. But it began to move, and this is personified in the 1990s by 3 books, which I strongly recommend you have a read of, if not, particularly one on the right, The Myth of Wild Africa. The things began to change. There were always people who were saying what I'm saying now, but they weren't always listened to. But there was a movement, and the one on the right from Jonathan Adams and Tom McShane at WWF really did change things, I think. But unfortunately, there was a huge backlash. And that backlash is represented by these books, all perfectly good books, you know, worth reading. But they're people with different philosophies. So this is saying, no, this is the last stand for nature. We have to have protected areas, exclusion, enforcement, and, you know, bad luck for people. They don't all say that, but roughly that's what they're saying. Bill Adams, some of you may have heard of him, James Murrumbedzi and I wrote this critique of that, Back to the Barriers, and how the narratives in nature conservation were changing. And actually they were flip-flopping backwards and forwards with time. You could see, you know, this was in fashion, that was out of fashion. It's like everything else. These things seem to go in waves. But while the barriers were actually resisted in the end, to be frank, progress has been a bit disappointing. So CBNRM is something that many of you will probably have never heard of. Let me tell you that you could not get $1 from a donor in the 1980s unless you had the words community-based natural resource management in your proposal, right? That's how important it was. And now it's almost evaporated. You can still, you know, talk about rights and communities, but CBNRM as a concept got a bad name. People publish material saying this is fake news and money doesn't go to communities, it all gets stolen. And some of it may well have been true. But what it has done is return Africa's rural poor to the margins. They're not in the middle of the argument, right? They're on the periphery. There's a renewed effort to prohibit wildlife and its products from commerce. I went to the CITES meeting in Samarkand a couple of months ago, and you know there were very loud voices. There are still strong people, strong countries saying no, we don't want that. But certainly, it's the wave is getting bigger of people just saying we must ban all this wildlife trade. It's bad. It's ethically bad, and that's their point of view. Something else what I'm not very keen of, and this is a personal view of the world, of course, is enthusiasm for ecosystem services, offsetting biodiversity credits, and these market-based tools. Some of them will work, no doubt. many of them won't work and haven't worked. And in Southern Africa, we got badly burned from carbon credits. And I think that's I don't know whether that's going to go anywhere now. But this is really distant from local people, right? This is, business, big business coming in. I'm not against big business, but it can't be the only answer. So what we're looking for is the silver bullet, right? It's CBNRM. No, that didn't work. That's fake news. It's this. It's offsets. It's biodiversity credits. If you guys show me one biodiversity credit which is still there in 5 years' time, I'll eat this desk. I'll be too old to eat then anyway. But there's also a big move of private money to least protected areas. So organizations like Africa Parks, Peace Parks and others, and in some cases people are taking on whole species at a country level. These are not bad things. In fact, they have been phenomenally successful in doing what they say. They do what they say is on the tin. But again, local people tend to be dealt with at the margins. They're not totally ignored, but they're seen to be a barrier rather than part of the equation. And then we've got landscape level strategies. So we're moving now to talk a bit about KAZA. These are often focused on protected areas, but they hinge on the idea of connectivity and corridors. How are we doing for time? So while the barriers were resisted, So the final thing was then that landscape level strategies hinging on corridors, I think, is the one with some potential, right, out of all of these. They'll all find a place. Africa Parks does a great job, but it's not going to be available everywhere, right? It's not a menu that you could, it's not McDonald's. But I think the landscape approach is a very exciting second chance, where CBNRM took root. It's still going in some places, but it's not flavor of the month. But I think we can bring the good things back through this idea of landscapes. So this is the KAZA landscape. It's a big chunk of the world. It's bigger than California by some ways, 520,000 square kilometers, that's right. It's 5 countries. It's in that corner of Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, that funny bit of colonial legacy of Namibia, the Caprivi Strip, and Angola. I'll come back to it in a moment and talk more about those colors. But its proper name is the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Area. As I say, it's 520,000 square kilometers, and it's got over half the elephant population of Africa in that space. The survey number, there was 227,000, if I remember rightly, but the confidence intervals are quite wide, as anyone who's done aerial surveys will know. And the jewel of tourism, the Victoria Falls, is bang in the middle of that. I mean, literally geographically in the middle. Fantastic area. The argument here was, when it started, was you've got these parks like Mavinga in Angola, Makadikadi, Hwange, Chobe, in Zimbabwe, Matusadona, Chizurira, you've got Chirisa, Cheti, which is safari areas, and Kafui. And these all had quite significant wildlife populations, especially elephants. And the observation was made that they are becoming islands. There are more and more people, more and more activities, economic activities in terms of agriculture, and these animals are getting cut off. So KAZA was all about connectivity. How can we take this landscape and connect these areas so that animals can move from over there in Matusadona over to Hwange, which they've done historically. Even in my time working there, elephants with the radio tracking would take elephants, they would pick them up in Matusadona and they would end up down in Hwange, and quite possibly over in Botswana, and maybe even up to Angola. Those movements were common. So the idea was to protect those corridors, or to identify and protect those corridors, right, to have connectivity, genetic connectivity and exchange. And there's been some fantastic research on this. So this is a paper which just came out recently. Robin Naidu was the lead author. He's from WWF, chief scientist in the US. And the red squiggles are the movements of, I think that's male elephants, and the blue ones, I think, are female elephants, right? There are 300 radio-collared elephants, and they've been followed by satellite. So you can see where this sample has moved. There's lots of other data as well, which fill in some of the gaps here, because you think about it, you might collar 10 elephants, and they might use a particular route, but the other 10 elephants might have gone a different way. So, sample size is important. But you can see there is some connectivity between some of these areas. But there are also some places where, if you look at Kafui, there really isn't any connectivity to the south. So that corridor, if it existed, is gone. And similarly, the Matusadana to Chisarira, and between Chisarira and Hwangi, is almost completely unrepresented there. It doesn't mean to say it's not there in part, but it's not what it used to be. So this is really gets interesting, well, to me anyway. If you look at that place, that map, and you go on to Protected Planet, the reason it was interesting because when I was head of WCMC, we created Protected Planet. The World Database on Protected Areas before that was just a spreadsheet with a list of names and some hectares, and we turned it into a geospatial database. And these areas that are green are all in the database, and they all have some conservation value. Some are protected areas, IUCN Category 1 national parks, and some are wildlife management areas where there may be farming and other things going on, but you can hunt in those areas, and so they have a wildlife purpose. So if you look at that, you would think, well, look at the connectivity there. I mean, you don't have to go far to get between there and Kafui. We can make this into a corridor. But let's take a close look at an area there on the Zambezi between Zambia and Zimbabwe, and really zoom into it. And these blocks here, this is at Hwange National Park, this is Matete Safari Area, and these blocks are game management areas. There are people hunting them, they are concessions, and they were, for many, many years, only used for wildlife offtake. And if we look a bit closer at Namanga there, that's where we are told the elephants will be migrating all the way along the edge of the river to Victoria Falls from across Zimbabwe. And they used to go all the way, it's quite possible they went all the way from one ocean to the other. But if you look at the satellite map there, you can see the brown stuff there, the light brown, the dark brown, that's agriculture, right? That's people's farms. Relatively new, there's always been settlement there, but expanded very rapidly. But you'll see that protected area now, right, which comes right down here, it comes right down to the middle of the major settlement. The only area for elephant to trek are along the north by the river, and that's really tough terrain. I mean, even elephants struggle to get through there, and I can't see why they'd bother going for a walk for fun. And if you overlay it, and I apologize for the resolution, once you zoom in that much, you can't. But you can see the red there. The elephants are moving in that area, but they're moving around the agricultural bit. And the ones in the north, there's one animal got through there, but otherwise most of them just turn around and go back. They are not moving right across. It's not a corridor with connectivity anymore. So let's talk about connectivity and corridors then. And you'll be pleased to know that I'm coming towards an end. First of all, there is an idea, and it's probably in our community. Those of us who are obsessed with wildlife research, management, conservation, we come at it, most of us, from a wildlife point of view. And there are people who view these and describe them as elephant superhighways. And connectivity in KAZA is really important, right? Connecting up those areas. There's no doubt about it from a conservation point of view, but also from a tourism point of view, right? It is important to keep those resources on the ground. And corridors are getting a lot of attention. I think it's the next big thing because they are so important. And these areas, this connectivity is so under threat. And it's in the Global Biodiversity Framework, it's in donor portfolios, and these landscapes are getting quite a lot of support. But mostly they're delineated by ecological spatial modeling, movement data, habitat models, and resistance surfaces, right, where the animals can't get easily. All of that is great science, right? But this illustrates what I call cartographic connectivity. It gives enormous academic satisfaction, but I'm being generous by saying it doesn't always have a lot of practical applicability. Because communities are generally considered background context or risk variables, right, from this kind of mentality, this point of view. And incentives for local people are inherently everyone understands there has to be incentives for local people, but they don't involve discussions that much with local people, and they don't involve the really key issues about tenure, institutions, governance. Governance is part of a lexicon which we don't really understand that well, even now in nature conservation. So the reality is that corridors are not empty spaces. They're lived in, they're governed, and they're highly contested landscapes, right? People are contesting them between themselves, never mind between elephants and landscapes. Most corridors traverse communal land, customary land supporting smallholder farming, pastoralist, mixed livelihoods. I mean, this is where people live and have their gardens and their farms. And they experience a corridor, you know, not as a superhighway, but as fields, grazing area, homesteads, which are at risk from wild animals. And we tend to treat the social consideration as constraints, which they are from our point of view, but they have to be also determinants of success. So we've created a hierarchy, which is connectivity first, people second, and that's really dangerous, and it's not going unnoticed. Because in the long term, viability depends very little, frankly, on ecological optimization, but it depends on the behaviors and attitudes of local people. And frankly, without more awareness and engagement in our community, you can expect a lot of resistance from local people, a lot of resistance. And if you look, I did a Wordle. I mean, I searched, actually, no one does Wordle or anything anymore. I just put it into ChatGPT, of course. I fed 2 papers in and said, give me 2 word clouds. And so it turned out there are 2 epistemic self-reinforcing communities. We are one, broadly speaking. So the biological science framing, we talk about corridors, permeability, you know, least cost path. Right? We have good technical language, we understand it. But there's a political ecology framing as well, where they talk about land tenure, communities, governments, livelihoods. Those words don't appear anywhere in the papers that our community was generating. And they don't have anything about nature, elephants, connectivity, incentives. These are 2 communities working in the same place without any common language or any point of view. But the bottom line is, and I am coming to an end, is that these are the people who will decide whether wildlife continues to exist, whether corridors continue to exist, and bottom line is, they will determine the future of rural Africa. So don't ignore them. Right? They have to be at the heart of this. And at the moment, my plea is that they're not at the heart of this. And somehow we have to find the time, the money, and the interest in our own community to put them at the middle. So I'll finish with 6 recommendations. I'll do this quite quickly. I don't want to have a bunch of people sleeping. The first one is that we all need to reframe, and that means us as whether we're mathematical conservationists, ecologists, whatever we might label ourselves as, we need to recognize people live there. We need to integrate tenure, rural development, livelihoods into our strategies. And we need to make sure that the communities are co-owners, they're co-authors of those strategies, not recipients of it. You've heard this before, for years and years and years. We still do it. We still go to these places, we drive through it, we don't speak to anyone. The second is we've got to broaden our partnerships. We can't just work with each other, right? We need to bring in rural development, agriculture, political science, people who know about land use, people who know about socioeconomics. And for us, they're difficult to work with. But I can tell you, for them, we are difficult to work with as well, right? But we don't have a common lexicon at all. But we do need to build, this is getting a bit technical, but I mean, local observatories where people can come together and talk about what's going on and what they like and what they don't like. There is no forum that in any of these places that I've seen. And these things are expensive and difficult. We do need to scale up climate smart agriculture, which is a big focus, and market access and tourism linkages, right? That is happening. That's one thing that has been doing well. But we need to move beyond short-term incentives, these hoping that biodiversity funds are going to flow from offsets or something. And we need more long-term incentives, which often means, I think, use. The fourth, we need to include socioeconomics in our monitoring. We monitor lots of things, number of animals, whatever. We don't know anything about the people. We don't know why they're there. We don't know where they're from. Were they born there? Did they migrate there? What do they want in their lives? What are they trying to do? What would they rather do? We know nothing. We don't gather any data from them. We don't get data on even whether they like us or not. I'm pretty sure I could tell you what the answer would be. But why aren't we collecting that data? Why aren't we getting the socioeconomic data? And then we need to engage more with land use and regional planning. Even though in Zimbabwe, the KAZA, the government's very enthusiastic, the parks is working really hard on it. WWF, all sorts of organizations, local organizations are working on it. There's no engagement with the regional planning authorities, almost none, right? Which is like, well, I don't even know how to describe it. I'm speechless. And then we need, as I've said all the way through this, we need to standardize connectivity and find a common language. So we need a landscape-wide lexicon, right, which everybody can understand, and we need to bring the social science language into it, and we need to be talking the same language. So you can actually have a meeting with somebody who's from a development agency and understand it. I'll give you a little anecdote at the risk of spending too long. Having worked for 6 months on a program in KAZA, we suddenly ran into some Land Rovers. Well, not Land Rovers these days. That's showing my age, isn't it? They're all Japanese, a Japanese brand which will remain unadvertised. With the name of an organization on the side. And we stopped them. And they said they had put in 4,000 boreholes for farmers. They had something like 800 people working in Matabeleland North, and they had a budget of some $700,000. Now, that was all USAID money, and it's all gone. But nevertheless, they were working in the areas that everybody else from the nature conservation bodies were working in. They didn't know anything about elephants. Elephants were a menace to the villages and to fresh water, and nobody that I spoke to, if you like, from our side of the divide, even knew who these people were. And yet they had people in every village in that area. I mean, the ideal partners. Unfortunately, USAID has disappeared, but it's a good example of how we just don't look forward. Finally, this stuff is difficult. It is difficult. And even if we try and do some of the things I was talking about, we may not succeed. But if we don't try, we can't succeed. So on that happy note, thank you very much.